I've always been drawn to art that gets described as mind-bending or hallucinogenic, and I don't think there's a better place than the cinema to explore these ideas. Since the counterculture of the 1960s, film has had a fruitful relationship with the psychedelic image. Ironically, the 60s counterculture films themselves rarely sought to emulate psychedelic experience. With some notable exceptions, they were usually more interested in depicting drug use and the associated culture of individual and sexual liberation. It wasn't until Stanley Kubrick's seminal Stargaze sequence in 2001: Space Odyssey that the psychedelic image was beamed successfully into live-action mainstream film. This rainbow-tinted tunnel effect is such a keystone of the cinematic psychedelic that today's filmmakers are still catching up with it. The influence of the counterculture, though, ran deep through the cinema of the 70s and beyond. The practical psychotropic fireworks of filmmakers like Alejandro Jodorowsky and Ken Russell were especially innovative in this regard, both of them making films that easily rivaled the effects of the drugs they were clearly inspired by. But hallucinogenic vistas were swirling around on cinema screens before the 60s too, thanks to the world of animation and the influence of the abstract and surrealist art movements of the early 20th century. When you watch 1951's Alice in Wonderland, or the famous pink elephant scene in Dumbo, or pretty much all of the madcap Fantasia, it's easy to believe that someone might have spiked the punch over at Disney HQ. But these films were all made at least a decade before the recreational prevalence of LSD. Animation flourished with psychedelia after the 1960s too, picking up the narcotic associations along the way. Films like Pink Floyd's The Wall and Fantastic Planet explored this in more adult and direct depth, and Disney seemed to be tuning in and dropping out during this bohemian scene in their 1970 film, The Aristocats. Now, with the meteoric rise of computer-generated imagery, live-action films resemble animated features more and more. So much so that the visual language of animation is carrying over, and this, in turn, has led to an insurgence of psychedelic imagery in general audience blockbusters. So now that mainstream live-action directors are gleefully looking down the kaleidoscope for inspiration, how are they using psychedelic imagery? To what effect? And what are the future possibilities for these computer-generated trips down the rabbit hole? Naturally, the most straightforward use of psychedelic CGI is to depict the drug experience itself. Gaspar Noé's Enter the Void brazenly aims to be a cinematic drug trip in its entirety, beginning with a moody first-person DMT sequence that goes on for nearly 7 minutes. Geometric fractals fade into more overwhelming, abstract renderings. It's both an unsettling and ambitious scene, which adequately prepares you for the film that follows. Noé's trippy melodrama goes on to depict a post-death experience still from the first-person perspective, including this prolonged CGI tour of Tokyo, supernaturally accentuating the city's saturated neon colour scheme. Despite the obvious vision of Noé's film, I'm less interested in literal depictions of drug use, and more in how mainstream cinema is projecting psychedelia for large audiences. One of its biggest associations is with the unconscious world of dreams. In Christopher Nolan's now iconic Inception, we watch a self-repeating cityscape folded on itself. This fractal dream vision of Paris is bolstered by a plot that is all about the power of the subconscious experience and the danger of time dilation. But there are no narcotics in Nolan's world. Here the psychedelic is synonymous only with the subconscious. What's notable about Nolan's dream world is actually how ordinary it is. It's a grey cityscape, a fancy hotel, and a concrete snow fortress. There are none of the wild colours or crazy abstractions that we usually associate with dreamlike imagery, especially when you compare Inception to another psychedelic trip inside a dreamer's head, Tarsum Singh's The Cell. Made in the year 2000, the CGI may be dated, but is still daring. In the film, Jennifer Lopez plays a psychiatrist entering the dreams of a serial killer, As a result, the dreams are macabre and highly composed. The psychedelic features are there to confuse and horrify the viewer, where Nolan is aiming for awe. Inception uses reflected surfaces and other features of reality to project psychedelic imagery onto an otherwise ordinary world. It is the dream of memories, not of imagination. Nolan is more interested in how the psychedelic plays with reality, not how it crafts an alternative one. When a filmmaker like Singh is tripping, he does it with his eyes closed, where Nolan has his wide open. Another common use of psychedelic imagery in modern blockbusters is the upgrade scene. Usually someone has gained some kind of mystical or chemically induced level up to their abilities. Of course, there is Neo in The Matrix, which plays on associations with Cyberdellic culture, which could be the topic of a whole video essay onto itself. There are also the neurological enhancements of Limitless, and more recently, Luc Besson's Lucy, which indulges in this pulpy upgrade sequence that also nods earnestly towards 2001, a trippy landmark that modern filmmakers seemingly cannot help but pay homage to. These sequences are so prevalent that they are parodied here in the Lego Movie in a short, subversive scene that does more than hint towards LSD-inspired imagery. Luc Besson returned with a whole trippy universe in Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets. It may have flopped hard at the box office, but it's an important entry in big-budget psychedelia. An adaptation of the 1960s counterculture comic, the city of the title is portrayed as an endlessly complex set of connected alien societies. It's science fiction by way of horror vacui, a psychedelic art practice where detail is expanded into every corner of the available canvas. Present everywhere from Hindu and Buddhist mandalas to the medieval European hellscapes of Hieronymus Bosch. Science fiction and comic books have always had a comfortable relationship with the psychedelic, as they are genres that regularly attempt to visualize that which is beyond reality. The familiar abstraction of the psychedelic exists as a metaphorical substitution for worlds that we cannot possibly visualize with accuracy. And this is how Marvel Studios routinely approaches the far out. Since Phase 3 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, their films have more enthusiastically embraced the cosmic side of their comic books, which means playing on the fantastic visions of one of their most revered comic artists, Steve Ditko. The co-creator of Spider-Man, Ditko was also responsible for Marvel's greatest psychedelic explorer, Doctor Strange, a comic that began in the 1960s and quickly developed a cult audience that knowingly appreciated its trippy, occult-inspired imagery. The 2016 film ran with these influences, producing what is probably the most self-consciously psychedelic sequence in big-budget cinema.
What's in that tea? Psilocybin? LSD?
It's just tea. With a little honey.
A far-out, spiraling and blindly detailed journey that embraces abstract and kaleidoscopic imagery to create a roller coaster ride through a cosmic multiverse. But Doctor Strange is not the only Marvel movie that takes the psychedelic plunge. Ant-Man and its sequel are also acid-inspired with their journeys to the subatomic world of the quantum realm. Here in the first film, fractal effects fill an otherwise empty void with a series of diffraction patterns designed to mimic the behaviour of certain subatomic particles. In 2018's Ant-Man and the Wasp, we again visit the quantum realm, this time in more detail. It's just as abstract, but this time director Peyton Reed decides to fill the void, using saturated, shimmering colours in a morphing landscape. In this blink-and-you'll-miss-it scene, hidden in the buzz of the quantum realm, there is something that resembles a city, playing to the psychedelic illusion of seeing patterns where there are none, and the psychedelic superstition that maybe there is order behind all this chaos. But perhaps the most ambitious use of psychedelic CGI is that where it stands for nothing concrete, the kind that confronts audiences with the chaos and complexity of psychedelia and offers no clear interpretation of what it all means. With this in mind, David Lynch returned to screens with the long-awaited third season of Twin Peaks, and in the 8th episode, he dropped a bomb. Lynch, of course, is famous for his surreal and abstract visions, and this is just another in a long line of bold visual experiments. Here he uses psychedelic imagery to depict the birth of an undefinable modern evil. This is a bad trip, perhaps the very worst. He uses the chaos of psychedelia to discombobulate television audiences that are unprepared for this level of violent abstraction. What is perhaps most disturbing is when we emerge from this trip into a recognisable reality, it has changed too, perhaps irreversibly. In his 2018 film Annihilation, Alex Garland approaches a similar crisis. When Nolan and the Marvel directors intend to awe us with their imaginary worlds, Garland reaches instead for the Gothic definition of the sublime. That which contains awe and terror in equal measure. Terror that the atoms that make up our bodies are insignificant and easily repurposed by a higher consciousness. Garland's shimmering natural world is one where time no longer makes sense, and the ecosystem self-replicates to the point of demolishing what stands in its way. Annihilation confronts the existential horror at the heart of the psychedelic experience. Natalie Portman's character comes face to face with the void, and the void stares back, and she is left without a clear grasp on her identity. And this is the threat of the psychedelic, that our identities are potentially meaningless, that there is a larger world out there that is beyond our comprehension, and that individuality is an illusion. The recent embrace of psychedelic imagery points to interesting possibilities for the CGI medium. In a cinematic landscape where actors can be convincingly de-aged, giant battle sequences are standard fare, and fantasy landscapes can be received with a shrug, where can CGI go next? And there are a lot of answers to that question. But as it becomes more affordable to independent and experimental films, I hope there will be many more journeys down the psychedelic rabbit hole, and beyond that there will be further explorations of abstract imagery without easy interpretation. Whatever you may think of CGI, it's hard to imagine the modern cinema without it, and for me, the most rewarding trips have always been the ones to the cinema.